Welcome back, everybody, to the afternoon sessions of the conference, Art, Sacred, and the Common Good. Once again, thanking our co-hosts, the Continuing Education Program at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I'm a professor, and Scala Foundation, a nonprofit that I started to promote classical liberal arts education and beauty and wisdom. We have two panels this afternoon. Right now, we're going to pick up with our discussions from this morning about different forms of beauty and their place in the common good with our panel on art. But I will turn this now over to our moderator for this afternoon, George Harne.
Thank you, Margarita. Can you hear me? Is it working? All right, thank you. Welcome back. We're going to have a good conversation here this afternoon, and I hope get down into some of the nitty-gritty of making beautiful things. We have some experts here on our panel who do that. My name is George Harne. I'm the executive dean at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and I'll be your moderator. If you need to get up and get coffee, please feel free to do that. This is the worst slot of the day, right? Everyone. So if someone next to you starts snoring, just nudge them, and we won't embarrass them, I promise. So it's great to have, as I said, two expert makers on this panel. We have David Clayton, who's the provost, of Pontifex University, and Paul Jernberg, the founding director of the Magnificat Institute of Sacred Music. And in addition to their sort of administrative leadership work that their titles suggest, I think it would be safe to say at heart, you make things. This is what you do. You're makers, first of all. So we can talk about the philosophy of beauty, the theology of beauty, and that can be a very fruitful conversation. But things get complicated when we start talking about making it and what it's like to live the life of a maker. So maybe we could begin, would the two of you mind sharing a bit about your background? How did you come to be doing what you're doing? And what it's like to be someone who's seeking to make beautiful things in the year 2022.
Well, I'm from Chicago originally, but my family on my father's side is from Sweden. And we have a wonderful tradition in our family of music makers, and my grandmother was a concert violinist. And my father was a violinist, and we had lots of music in our family. And I grew up in a Swedish Baptist church and that tradition as a young person. And just surrounded by wonderful music a lot of the time. And that certainly was how I got started at first, and from a very early age I started studying the piano. As I got into high school, I became very much involved in piano performance, and I went on to university and studying piano performance. And at the same time, I studied composition and music theory at American Conservatory, other places as well. So basically, out of school, I worked as a pianist, soloist, and accompanist, and did a lot with ballet, a lot with opera. Loved that. Along the way, I got sidetracked for a while as a swimming coach. I was a swimming coach for 8 years.
That's in the biography I didn't read, by the way.
Oh, right.
So I found that on the internet, actually.
Yeah, right. So that's sort of a whole other story. But I continued to be a musician and a pianist even when I was doing that. But it took me to Sweden, and where I continued. Eventually, got back into music full time, and had many wonderful experiences there in giving concerts. Also, even working as I shouldn't say it, but a piano entertainer in different, but always continuing to a certain extent with a classical tradition as a classical piano soloist and accompanist, as well as doing lots of other kinds of things. While I was in Sweden, which was basically between 1983 and 1993, I had the opportunity to live very close to a Franciscan monastery in a suburb of Gothenburg. And that was an amazing experience that over a period of 2 years was a real epiphany for me, in that I discovered, and while I was there, I was very much involved in all sorts of music in town and doing all sorts of things. And I brought a gospel choir to Sweden in 1988 from Chicago. That was an amazing experience. But in the midst of all this activity and creativity, I did composing, and I composed music for a musical theater production and all sorts of wonderful creative opportunities. But living close to this Franciscan monastery introduced me to a whole new dimension of music without in any way minimalizing my love for other music. But it opened a whole new world for me, which hopefully you got just a little taste of it this morning. Everything we did this morning, in a sense, comes from what I learned from the friars, because they really lived a life, on the one hand, the liturgy of the hours. They chanted the liturgy of the hours throughout the day. They had sung mass. They also were serving the poor. Had a very austere life. But some of you may have anyone here lived in Sweden? Not many people. Sweden is a place that for me was coming home in a way, because it was coming back to the land of my ancestors. But it's also a place, there's a lot of darkness in Sweden. Not only the dark winter nights, but also psychologically and spiritually. It's a country that has really succeeded, you might say, in secularizing the culture to an extent that we can't even imagine until you actually live there if you go to visit for a while, it's really a wonderful place to visit. If you live there for a year, maybe 2, you start encountering some of the darkness. But living close to the Franciscans really was like observing a daily miracle, because they were living a whole different culture within, and how did they do that? And it wasn't just a matter of, somehow these were really good guys. They were good guys, but they weren't. There was no. There was some mystery going on here. And to me, I discovered in living close to them over a period of time that it really, I discovered the source, and that was for me a big discovery, especially coming from a Baptist background, and these are Catholic Franciscan friars. It was strange. In many aspects, it were very strange for me. But at the same time, it was resonating at a deep level that I'd never experienced before. So anyway, there's a lot I could say about that. But getting back to the aspect of music, that was a real, had a major influence on me as far as my understanding of sacred music and the gift of sacred music. And the gift of our ancient traditions, you might say, of chant, both West and East. So these particular friars had gone through a whole period of development where they actually did quite a bit with Eastern chant, Eastern Orthodox / Catholic chant as well. So that was part of their liturgical life. And this was, as I say, it was an epiphany for me. And so my wife, while I lived in Sweden, I met my future wife, who was from France, and visiting in France. And there were some real wonderful influences there, which I won't go into right now. But we came back to the States in 1993, and I worked in the inner city of Chicago, and I was received into the Catholic Church in 1992, actually. So I started working in a Catholic parish in the inner city of Chicago. And since that time, I've been working has been a strong sense of vocation to work in sacred music. And so my experience in different parishes, in Chicago and then in Massachusetts, for a while in Peoria, for a while in France. We went back to France to be closer to my wife's family for a while. But most of the time, over the last 30 years, we've been in Massachusetts. And so while in Massachusetts, I had the great privilege of being associated with a little school called Trivium School. It was a private Catholic school where they really are, the whole vision was one of the liberal arts or pre-liberal arts and classical education. And part of that was a sense of immersion in musical traditions of the church, but also of the intellectual and artistic traditions. So that also had a real powerful, that was a great gift for me to be able to continue to develop my gifts. And but working in parishes made me aware of this, and I'll try not to say too much because I know we need to leave space for this later, but I experienced this longing to share with people the gift that I had received that was more than just music. It was like something about the faith, but also the music that was an integral part of the faith that had this gift to draw people in deeper. And so that was I had that longing starting in Chicago when we came back and then working in Massachusetts. And that is really that longing to communicate and realizing that the traditional forms for us in the West, Gregorian chant and Renaissance polyphony, which are sort of the prominent examples of that, that they wouldn't always work. I mean, I love Gregorian. I'm totally oriented, or I think I think for church musicians, immersion in chant and polyphony is really important. But I realized that wasn't enough in the parishes that I worked. So that longing and that sense of love and wanting to communicate something important to people is really what got me started composing sacred music. And then so that's sort of the basic story, and then it went from there. And then as I worked in different parishes, that's what this drew out this sense of, okay, I have a gift here, I have a responsibility, even if it's not perfect, even if it's not, who can compare with Palestrina and Victoria and Josquin and so forth and so on. But you see, if we're thinking in terms of reaching people, then this is what drew me out to go beyond, to venture into this daunting field, but then experiencing a real grace with that, and since 2017, so it's the life of a church musician. Believe me, if you don't realize this, it's not easy. It's it's usually a very rough road as far as making a living and having a family and putting that all together and working, double time and just doing and every weekend, every Sunday, every feast day. So I'm not complaining. This is what I signed up for, but just realize there's a lot of work that goes into that. In 2017, I had just a wonderful opportunity. I was offered the possibility to do my composing full time, and also to work on a broader level with the renewal of sacred music in the Catholic Church full time. So this was a great grace for me. So since 2017, we started Magnificat Institute, which has been a sense, part of it is just supporting my work as a composer, but then also with this broader vision, it's really much more than just about one composer, me or someone else. It's really about discovering the principles of sacred music too. And how can this be applied to our parishes where people are starving for this? So.
Thank you, Paul. For those of you who have joined us just recently, this panel, the theme of the panel is Ever Ancient, Ever New, Bringing Traditional Art Forms into Modern Spaces, and we're talking to Paul Jernberg, the founding director of the Magnificat Institute for Sacred Music, and David Clayton, provost of Pontifex. So,
hello.
Good.
Yes, thanks, Paul. Thanks, George. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. Just talking about my story, it's listening to Paul, it involves again a sense of how I began to recognize a calling or a sense that this is what I wanted to do and it might be the right thing to do. My story is that I grew up in England, and as early as I was able to make a choice, I opted out of anything to do with religion or church whatsoever. But by my mid-20s, I was beginning to realize that that didn't make for a happy life. And by chance, I met somebody in London, and that in itself is a story, who offered sort of spiritual guidance to people. I didn't know that's what he was doing. I just had this conversation with this guy, and I'd seen the effect that he'd had on others. And he asked me a question. He said, if you inherited so much money, that you didn't have to work for a living. You could just choose what you wanted to do, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. What would you want to do? And I said, paint. That's what I'd like to do. I'd never really done any, but that's what I wanted to do. And he said, well, I think I can show you a way that at least might open the door to that. That's the good news, but the bad news is that this is a spiritual program, and you're going to have to act as though God exists. And it began with a program of prayer and meditation, and I was ready to do it. I mean, the whole question as to why I was ready to trust this guy comes down to his personality and the place I was at the time. But he gave me this routine initially of prayer and meditation, and he said, try it for 30 days, and if you don't like it, we'll return your misery with interest. And so I did it. I mean, I just got down on my knees. I remember shutting the curtains in the bathroom so that no one could see in. Not that the glass was that bobbly glass that you couldn't make anything out anyway, and there was only a brick wall beyond it. But nevertheless, I felt so strange, actually, praying. But I did it, and I realized that what he was giving me was a sort of Pascal's wager. Just try it and see, effectively. And if it works, then keep doing it. And so through this process, I immediately began to feel a change. There was no dramatic events, but incrementally, but nevertheless perceptibly, I felt happier. I could feel there was a change. And I wrote about this program, incidentally, in a book on discernment of vocation called The Vision for You, in quite a lot of detail. And so he showed me how to do this. The other thing that he didn't tell me initially was that he was Catholic, and everything that he was telling me, while he didn't make it explicit, was informed by the faith. And so having had this introduction to, just by going through the motions of prayer and meditation, and he made me volunteer for service even, I got a faith. What began as just hope became faith. And eventually, it's quite a long story, I became Catholic. And part of that was that I told him I was investigating Christianity. And he said, we were in London, by the way. He said, why don't you go to this church? And he told me where it was, and go at 11 o'clock. And we had a conversation about something completely different. And as I said goodbye to him at the end of the conversation on the Saturday afternoon, he said, oh, by the way, make sure you go at 11 o'clock. And he was directing me to solemn mass at a church called the Brompton Oratory in London, which it might still, I mean, I have this sort of recollection of going there, but it might still be the most beautiful choir I've ever heard. And I remember going in and just having a sense that all the art, everything that people were doing was coordinated. It was grabbing my senses. I don't think I'd ever heard polyphony actually performed before. I must have heard it, in recordings or something. But I remember thinking, this is what angels sound like. That was just the thought that popped into my head. And I looked up to see where the choir was, and there was an angel in mosaic flying across the ceiling. And so this impression drew me into the church, and it was, there was a fair bit of the journey beyond that, but always what the magnet, if you like, was this sense that the liturgy, the worship of God, is at the heart of this, and the beauty of the culture that comes out of that wellspring is really rooted in truth. It's rooted in God. And as I went on this journey, the other thing that David, this guy, said to me, he said that he quoted, he said it was Bach. I since searched for it. I couldn't find an exact quotation, but he said, anyway, J.S. Bach said that the reason he composed was to give glory to God and joy to mankind. And that I see beauty, therefore, as a sign that I'm doing that. It's something that indicates So there is a purpose to this, a very real purpose, and I am a utilitarian, just that I have the greatest sense of what is useful, and it is useful to give glory to God. That's what we're here for. Ultimately, that's the greatest purpose that I could assign to what I do. And so I always associated beauty with that end. And it is associated with human happiness. That we want to direct people to God and transmit to them the sense of the joy that is available through the faith. And a beautiful culture speaks of that. It speaks of a society whose core values actually reflect that. In some way, you might say beauty is I heard a definition, beauty is the radiance of being, but a beautiful culture is the radiance of the common good, in a sense. Everything is directed towards that end, and we perceive it in the interrelationships in a way that you can't just by looking at a single person or a single action. It's a pattern that emerges from that society. And it's in the culture of the Catholic Church, and when the Church is really firing on all cylinders, which does not always happen and probably isn't at the moment, in that respect, it pours over into the contemporary society. But if we want that to happen, we begin right where you're working and I'm trying to work. It's in those forms that are connected to the liturgy and to the worship of God. Anyway, so I decided I'll just finish very quickly, don't worry. Decided I wanted to learn to be an artist, so what do? You look up Catholic Art School in the London telephone directory, and it just wasn't there. So I then expanded it a little further, and I couldn't find anything. So I decided what I'm going to have to do is found the school and then enlist as its first student. Then I just couldn't find anyone to teach anything. I'd find a bit here, a bit there, something here, a bit of my own research. And so then I realized I was going to have to effectively establish and design the program myself. And eventually I got a job through a mentor, someone who became a mentor of mine, a guy called Stratford Caldecott, who I know some of you are aware of. He sort of took me under his wing, helped me a great deal, helped me to start writing articles. I got a job through an introduction from him as artist in residence at a liberal arts college in New Hampshire called Thomas More College of Liberal Arts. And I just filled the chapel with the art. So this St. Michael, the Archangel, is 6 foot long and 3 feet wide, and it's on the back wall of the chapel on a wooden panel, adapted from a Gothic illumination. I've modified it slightly in ways that I felt were going to connect with the students at that college. And I started to write about my ideas of how to effectively establish a school that might, or a formation is perhaps a word, that might allow Catholic artists to once again start producing art in harmony with the liturgy, that is participating in tradition, but nevertheless speaking to people in the modern age so that it connects with them. So it brings the universals, if you like, together and then speaks of them in such a way that people today can understand it in sort of visual vocabulary. And so I started a blog called The Way of Beauty. At a certain point, I pulled all of that together and actually published a book called The Way of Beauty. And my current employer, it is a little longer than this, but effectively they approached me and said, would you start a program based on that book? And so this was the Master of Sacred Arts program at Pontifex University, which is now running, which is the formation. It's not teaching the painting, it's teaching everything else, so that the artist knows, when you put your brush to the canvas, does it go left or does it go right? You have to make those sort of decisions. And then they decided that they wanted this to be the inaugural program of a new online university, so I became provost, and that's how I have the title that I have. stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, in light of all that you've shared in terms of the journey, if we frame this in terms of the classical four causes, you've said a bit about the efficient cause. You two are the efficient causes of what you make. Maybe we could look at how you relate to the other causes, the materials that you use, kind of the question of form. And David, you said a bit about the end, the telos. You did as well, Paul. But I'm interested in the idea of how you make. You're sitting down. You've both received commissions. You're on a deadline. You've got to make something beautiful. What do you do?
So, all right, yeah. Okay. First thing, see if anybody else has done it first and then copy it. That's the great thing. Being in a tradition, you don't have to be original. Then what you do is you change as little as possible in order to meet the needs of the time. Well, I'm joking a bit, but that actually is what tradition is about. It's recognizing what people have done in the past, seeing what is good, and having the humility to say, I don't need to change that. Inevitably, what comes through is an aspect of the personal interpretation, personal style, and then you do inform that with considerations of what that particular congregation say, the people who are going to see it. You're not thinking of the whole human race, you're thinking of those particularly for whom it is intended or who are going to worship in that space, for example. What are they likely to respond to? And sometimes that means talking to people, getting a sense of the community, and then working out how to modify it, as I say, as little as possible. And there are various traditions you can choose from. If they commission me, they probably would be looking for something with a sort of iconographic or Gothic feel to it, I would say. But then you have to work out how to modify it in such a way that you don't undermine what you sense to be the core principles of the tradition. It must speak of the universals as well, not just the particular. You've got to blend all of this. It must be of its time, of its place, and that nevertheless in harmony with all that's gone on before that's good. As to the materials, I tend to work in egg tempera, which is where you put pigment into egg yolk and you make a thick paste and then you dilute it with water, and I paint on wooden panels generally. You prepare a drawing, you do it in great detail, and then put the drawing onto the panel. Egg tempera dries very quickly, to the degree that if you just do that, the first one is dried by the time you apply the second one in some instances. So it's the problems of blending and grading tone and colour are very different, and so you have to be aware of how you do that. So again, you think in advance quite a lot. There's very little sort of spontaneous expression. It's really as well thought out in advance. You have to plan what you're going to do. And if it's good, then people will respond in the way that you hope for, which is that it directs them not to me, but to the saint in question and ultimately to God in their attention.
So this is so interesting because I think it's very, in my mind, it's very different with music. Because I do see that, well, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, an immersion in our great traditions is essential for anyone who really wants to do something serious. Because we do have these traditions, you might say, that have worked so marvelously and so beautifully for so many centuries that are rooted in the early church and in Christ and the apostles. So that sense of rootedness of doing chant and doing polyphony in a way that is done well and done with deep depths of spirituality is, in my mind, an essential preparation. However, given this situation we're in right now, my sense has been that with the people that I've worked with the parishes I've worked with, that it's not simply a matter of doing something like Gregorian chant in a new way that's going to resonate, or doing counterpoint, Renaissance classic polyphony in a way, but it's more like exploring new possibilities that are in harmony with that and that are going to work well. So in my experience, again, I think some people are doing great things, and I don't want to in any way minimize that. The people who are doing wonderful polyphony in sort of a contemporary style at the service of the liturgy, and I think there's real value in that. For myself, and part of it goes back to my involvement with the Franciscans in Sweden, and the fact that they did use harmonized chant from Eastern Catholic and Orthodox traditions. That seemed to me to be a key to connecting with our contemporary culture. And I saw, and so I saw. Now this is, I'm going to just say this, and it's may be easily misinterpreted. But my wife is, as I mentioned, is from France. She grew up near to Taizé. It was an ecumenical community there. And if any of you ever visited Taizé, ever been there, because it's quite an experience actually to go there and to experience 2,000 or 3,000 people singing what is essentially the Liturgy of the Hours, but it's done in an ecumenical. It's not following the breviary. But basically what they do is to take different phrases from the Scripture, and Jacques Berthier was the composer of the original repertoire of Taizé music. And he is quite an accomplished organist and musician, and he composed in all sorts of different styles. But he got together with Brother Robert, who was at Taizé, and they had this vision of creating this new repertoire. And basically what Jacques Berthier did, was to draw upon the Eastern Orthodox tradition, but also on his background in Gregorian chant and the Western tradition, to do this new inspiration that I think, in my mind, there was something about it that just really worked well. But don't get me wrong, so I'm not advocating that we should just do a lot of Taizé music, but there's something about the way he put together melody, rhythm, and harmony that clothed these texts in a way that just seemed to be very fitting. And so I really owe a lot to him, and I had the opportunity to meet him and share. He died very young, in the early 90s. But his work has had a profound influence on me, but then my task, as I see it, has been to take this tradition of Eastern Orthodox harmonized chant, to take what he's done, and in a sense to use, not to copy it, but to take some of the principles of putting together harmony, melody with harmonies and rhythm in a way that is really appropriate to the Catholic liturgy. And whereas the music of Taizé is almost always a short phrase that's repeated. And if you've heard it in a parish situation, sometimes it can be very irritating, because it's just like, how many times are we going to do this now? And if it's not done with 2,000 people, it's done with maybe 3 people. It's maybe not always very effective or even appropriate in the Catholic liturgy. As I say, I'm not advocating that at all, but it's more the idiom that I think he was on to something. And so that has, I found that connection with Eastern Catholic and Orthodox music, and then also my exposure to the music of Roman Herko, who has done, some of you might be familiar with his work, that's also been a real influence on me. So in a way, I'm definitely not just taking chant and polyphony and copying it as closely as I can. I admit that. I think we need to always honor that patrimony. I mean, this is a great gift that we do have a responsibility to cultivate and preserve and sing with musicianship and spirituality. So I think we absolutely need places where we're doing that. And there's people in this room that are doing it much more than I really admire. And I think that, so that is absolutely essential in my mind. But also then, I've found these sources that have been, that's been sort of my material. Always, but always in, you might say, in reference to the great traditions, always in reference to the chant. So like in the lauds this morning, you notice that we used all these traditional psalm tones. I didn't compose, as I said earlier, I didn't compose any of those. Those have been around for, I don't know, they go back into antiquity, really. And so that's always been a part of what I do as well. And Pius, some of you are familiar with the writings of Pius X, who is a pope in the early 20th century, who is probably, he has written more officially on sacred music than, as far as I know, than any other pope. And he said, to the extent that new music is in harmony with, not meaning literally in harmony, but that works well with Gregorian chant and classical polyphony, then it's on track, so to speak. So that really speaks to me, because I think we always need to show honor and a certain reference to our great traditions. But then, out of zeal, out of the fervor of love that is seeking to reach everybody that comes into the church, I dare to try these new forms, and I find that there's and my experience is one of great grace and of confirmation of that from others. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think you and I have talked about this before, this idea that if a young person came and said, I want to become a composer of sacred music being the key there, one of the, obviously they need the training in harmony and counterpoint and all those things, but one other thing we might say to that person is, go take a book of classic chant and spend an hour a day for a year just singing that chant until it's part of who you are, and then close the book and begin composing. Because at that point you will have internalized it, right? And you'll have that spirit of the sacred music.
Yes, and I would add to that just that if it's at all possible to do that in a community, so that it is really, because I think by its nature also that it is a communal act, so to speak. And also, as Georgia, we had talked earlier about before too, that I don't in any way want to minimize the need for technical formation. It's really important. That can sort of get lost in this whole discussion. But I had the great privilege of working with a master of this, of modal counterpoint, Erwin Fisher, at American Conservatory in Chicago. So that all went into, if I hadn't had that foundation, a certain rigor, so that we don't want to forget about that need as well.
Right. And I'm dating myself with this reference, but those of you who've seen The Karate Kid, there's the wax on, wax off element, which I think is very much part of the formation of an artist. There's this dimension of you simply have to put yourself through the work with a good teacher and learn the basic skills until they're second nature. So both of you are standing, here we are in this year, you're seeking to draw on the tradition, to work within the tradition, and to extend the tradition. And at that level of abstraction, it's relatively easy. We can make gestures and nod our heads about the tradition and how great it is. But I'd like to hear some more specific details about which parts of the tradition you're bringing forward, which parts of the tradition are you leaving behind, and which parts of, after the revolution, you might say, which parts that have come about more recently in your arts are you drawing on? And so anything you could say about that would be appreciated.
Okay, so in terms of my own painting in this iconographic tradition, one of the people who taught me is an icon painter called Aidan Hart, who is based in the UK. He is Orthodox and he largely self-taught, actually. So he was a great teacher because as he taught me, he would explain how he'd worked out what he was doing. So in other words, he not only taught me what to do, what he was telling me to do, he explained to me the principles behind it and how he had discovered them himself by looking at past art. And in the field of art, we're really there's been such a dislocation from tradition that it needs people like this who have the capability of just looking and learning and developing it themselves in order then to start passing it on. So the history of iconography is that it began to be re-established in the middle of the 20th century as a tradition. It's not unbroken, it was re-established. A lot of work was done by particularly Russians in Paris, expatriate Orthodox Russians. But anyway, he moved to the UK, and he wanted to, as a good Orthodox, he believes that I'm a Catholic. He's very polite about it, but I'm definitely a heretic. And he wanted, for him, the straight line is Orthodoxy. The Catholic Church goes off here, and then the Protestants off here. Of course, for me, the straight line is Catholic, and everybody else is branching off at various times. But he looked at the UK and wanted to help the developing Orthodox community in England, which is growing at this time. English-speaking liturgy now in the UK, incorporating lots of new images of traditional British saints, Celtic saints, particularly those from before the schism. And he wanted to work out how to paint them in an iconographic style. And there weren't iconographic representations of them particularly. So he looked at a period in iconography that's called the Macedonian Renaissance, which is around 1000 AD, where you had an increase in naturalism. He actually incorporated that style to become his own, because he felt that if you had a very abstracted style of Russian iconography, for example, that many people just feel that it's so much of another world and another time that the English Orthodox, even those immersed in the Orthodox liturgy, wouldn't relate to it. So he drew in that style, and then he taught that to me. Then I'm more interested myself in a Gothic style. As a Catholic, I recognise not just the iconographic traditions, but the Gothic and also the Baroque, more naturalistic styles, taking my lead from Benedict XVI. And what I decided to do was look at Gothic illuminations in England, so really following the pattern that he did, and particularly there's an artist called Matthew Paris who there's a lot of manuscripts of his, and what you find is that he did effectively line drawing. It's description with line. You see the paper or the surface underneath, and then very loose washes. So there's some description of form by grading of tone and colour, but for the most part, the dominant tool that he uses is line, and he does it by varying the thickness. A line is effectively describing a conjunction in abbreviation between a dark area and a light area. So if you were to paint it as you actually see it naturally, you'd have to shade in one area and then you'd have another that's light. As a shorthand, you just do a line. And so you vary the width of the line and the flow of it as to whether or not the contrast between those two areas is great or less. A very thin line means that you have two conjoining areas that are close in tone but nevertheless distinguishable. Sometimes the line will disappear when, even though there's an object in front of a background, if they are of the same tone, you can't distinguish it. It takes great skill to do this. Even though children start with lines, shall we say adults finish with lines. And now we live in an age where description with line, especially at this period where we're used to seeing animation, comics, is very familiar to the modern age. And so one of the things that I'm steadily looking to do is develop what I've termed as the School of St. Albans style. This is where Matthew Paris was in St. Albans. But it's not just because I relate to it and it's English and I'm English. I'm sure there's a lot of that to it. It's part of the fabric of where I come from. But I feel that it is something that modern artists could do. And if you do an illustration course, for example, you would learn how to master line in this way, or an animation course. And so it's feasible that people can get the skills from different places, and if they want to put it to this end, they can then adapt what they've learned to the service of the church. And I can imagine that then that I feel that also looking at Matthew Paris, it has the essential qualities of that it's sacred. A lot of this, it just comes down to an intuition and whether you feel it's going to nourish prayer. And that really is my next sort of big project, is to develop that further. One thing I would say, just very quickly, is that I don't believe that, this is really for me, I mean, some people, they're inspired and God inspires whomsoever he pleases and you just don't know what they're going to be able to produce. But I can't see how I'm going to have a sense of what works well with the liturgy or what works well with prayer, excuse me, if I'm not habitually praying with sacred art. I mean, how can I possibly understand how the two are connected unless it becomes part of my own prayer? So I have an icon corner at home, a domestic church, and I actually think about what helps me to pray. And of course it's a subjective thing in many ways. I'm trying to work out, well, is this the right attitude? But ultimately, I'm hoping that I pray well, and then instinctively what I do is I paint in such a way that nourishes my own prayer. And then my hope is that it might feed others in such a way. You're trying to then relate that to how others might see it, but that's the way that I approach it.
So we're talking about how we're reaching people and finding new, just practical ways to do that.
And in particular, what aspects of the tradition you're choosing to carry forward,
Right.
which parts you're leaving behind,
Yes.
and then what parts of the sort of post-revolutionary,
Mm-hmm.
post-Schönbergian, Stravinskian revolution are you bringing on?
Right. So this is where I think that we were talking before about this immersion in the tradition, and if possible in a community, it comes into play, because it gets to what David is talking about, is that we need to understand the transcendent dimension of this. If we're simply focusing on the forms, and let's say doing Gregorian chant very well, doing Renaissance polyphony very well, without seeing the point of, and again, maybe this sounds utilitarian, but it really, there is a point, there is something beyond the music that this music is integrally connected to. It's a sacramental of sorts that is helping us to go deeper than the music itself. And I think that in a sense of intuition that one develops from that is absolutely essential. That to have that experience of sacred music drawing us into the mystical life, the contemplative dimension, right? And that it's something that all by nature, nobody's arrived at it. It's an aspiration, and we get glimpses of that. But I think that's without that spiritual experience, if I can put it that way, that we're going to be lost, and we're going to be focusing too much on the form. And I see there's a danger to simply say we need to revive the forms without that sense of the transcendent that is. So having said that, how do we draw from sources after the revolutions, as you put it? I certainly do. With this, the Russian and Eastern European Orthodox and Catholic music is certainly way pre-revolution, but I find that Jacques Berthier, again, has things that I think are truly inspired and in harmony with that. I think that Roman Herko also does that in a very different way. Berthier is more really providing, I think, ideas that have helped me with large group of people who are very different backgrounds. I think that's part of the genius of what he's done. And so there, yes, it's rooted in this Eastern Orthodox music, but it's different. Still, it's like it's different in some way, and I can't completely explain where he got that. There's an element of mystery, of like new inspiration, and so definitely there's some, and I know some people might disagree. People say, "Well, are you kidding me? Are you going to really try to, when we have Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony, are you really going to try to, to do something totally new?" And I think, yeah. And again, it's the motivation is not in thinking that I can somehow do something better by any stretch of the imagination, but that motivation is that fire of love of the Holy Spirit that is really seeking fervently to touch that person who walks in off the street, who's lost, or who's seeking, like as David walked into the Brompton Oratory. This is, I think, at the heart of the church musician is this desire to draw people into that transcendent dimension that is beyond mere form.
Just building on that, thank you, Paul. This is the struggle. I just think that in terms of creativity, a tradition which does not reapply its principles on a constant basis and understand how to speak to the era in which it's being created will die. And this is half the problem, that you can draw too much on the external culture, and that will then suffocate and destroy the Christian element, the universal element that is at the core of the tradition. But if it isn't an option not to do what you're describing in some way, you're not working in the traditions of chant or polyphony, or Western chant or polyphony, but nevertheless, you're drawing on those elements. And while what affected me in the Brompton Oratory was I'm pretty sure it was Palestrina, as I heard, and Gregorian chant. But I fully realised not everybody is going to react like that. The job of the reason why we need constant creativity is to draw people, if you like, into the canon as well. It should stand on its own merit. It should be potential. There's no reason why we can't produce stuff the equal of those people. We have God, we have man, we have the materials to do it. We shouldn't be pessimistic about this. But at the same time, there tends to be a canon, and who knows, yours might eventually become part of it. Who's to say? We'll know in about 500 years. But nevertheless, we have to work on that basis, I think. Those people, polyphony was new in its day, but it built on tradition. And sometimes those changes are great. You're making a greater change than I. But I can conceive that what would come out of this is a new and previously unimagined tradition of sacred art, for example, through the inspiration of Vatican II, which will take a long, long time to come forward, I'm thinking in the Catholic world. But even if it does, it will still have those core elements that make the existing tradition sacred in its context, which I believe is what you're looking to.
Thank you. Do you want to respond? So I want to extend this back to some previous questions and comments. The question of craft came up in an earlier conversation, which I think is sort of what we're talking about here, but also the historical dimension, and maybe the historical dimension of the materials you work with. David mentioned earlier a kind of crisis among artists after World War I. Adorno famously said to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. There was this idea that sometimes cultural catastrophes are of such a magnitude that you simply cannot continue on as though they hadn't happened, or you can't even, it distorts and undermines the very materials, the musical materials, maybe the visual materials, the styles. And yet I think something David suggested was that maybe there will come a time later where you can go back and retrieve, maybe when some of the wounds have healed. To what extent do questions of historical, obviously with chant, you've got the chant tradition, you've got polyphony. To what extent, in your experience, are aspects of your art, do they wear out? Do they become, they're simply too tired, you can't continue them? Or how can you breathe new life into things so that they are fresh? Because this is how we reach them with tradition. If it is stale and warmed over, no one's going to be interested. You mentioned this a little bit in the icons, but yeah.
So I think it's essential that those who do the tradition, that are singing chant and polyphony, that there's got to be a quest to discover what is it in this. Because it's not something on a piece of paper. Chant is not something on a piece of paper at all. That is just a tool to somehow discover something way beyond it in the actual singing. And so this is, in my mind, an essential quest for every church musician to discover that beauty. And it needs to have life and that infuses it. And so that's where I think there's this danger again of just, people will get tired of it when it's done in a mechanical way or when it's done in a formalistic way. And now, where are we with answering your question?
I don't know much about the visual arts, but music, I know that, there was an argument made earlier in the 20th century that tonality was dead. Yeah. That it had exhausted itself. And yet I think David's point was Respighi was able to go back to the modes and breathe new life into this. And composers are now writing fresh music in a tonal idiom. Right. So right. How does this apply to your area?
Yes. So it's a much longer conversation than we have in the next two or 3 minutes, but so this gets to another bigger question in my mind, which is the clear distinction between secular and sacred music, or secular, nowadays we need to say liturgical music. So the definition of the word sacred has somewhat shifted over the last 50 years or so, but so you're talking about these great, so I think on the one hand, there's a real important discussion about the music for concert and for art music, in the development of art music, basically, which sometimes, is this still working? Can you still hear me? Okay, good. So that is, I think you're touching on that in my sense when we were talking about Jernberg and all the whole direction of that sort of art music tradition, what happened to it is breakdown and the tendencies towards relativism or chaos, basically. And what do really serious composers of concert music do with that today? And I see people who really are recovering and finding new traditions. In my mind, the aspect of sacred music, there's something there that we're missing today. I think there's, and again, I'm going to start saying something that's going to hopefully lead on to conversations after this, but I think one of the big problems among us, those who are really serious composers, is that sometimes there's a confusion between the focus on secular venues such as concert and opera, and that is often, I think, taken then as the paradigm for what we're going to do in the liturgy if we're going to do something serious. My sense is more we need to rediscover this iconographic aspect of music that has been part of the tradition in the past and that we've lost that sense. So I hope that can stimulate some discussions.
Well, I think it's important that we've emphasized being immersed in the tradition. We also must engage with the modern culture if we're going to be able to speak to it. So we cannot retreat into a ghetto which is in total isolation But even a monk in a cloister is in some way a part of their time and place, so that no one can escape it altogether. But we must do so discerningly. So if you look at the art history from, I don't know, something, well, it depends how far back you want to go, but certainly the 20th century, a lot of those forms that we recognized as modern art forms, the style is developed to express theological and philosophical points, and many of them are anti-Christian. So you want to be very careful before you start pulling them in, or they're based on an anthropology that is not Christian, and to the degree that we think they're successful in representing that, if we pull that into Christian art, we're undermining our own faith. And so we want to reject those. Abstract expressionism may be good if you want to have a nice bit of sort of decor on the wall, if you know Rothko. Pick the right colours and it goes with the curtains and the carpet. Very nice. But if you think that this is a manifestation of the soul isolated from man, it doesn't make sense, because the way that we perceive the soul is through the body. And so you can't separate the two and paint it visually. So we need to be very careful before, in thinking about adopting these new styles. And so we must engage, but we must do so discerningly, I would say.
Yeah, and our missing interlocutor is Makoto Fujimura. I wish you were here today. That would be great. But that raises the question of what's appropriate for liturgy and worship and what's outside. So thank you very much.